They found him 3 days later, sitting in a Harlem speakeasy, untouched, while 14 of Dutch Schultz's best men were never seen again. So how does an unarmed numbers runner survive a mob hit when the police, the FBI, and even Lucky Luciano said it was impossible? The answer wasn't a gun. It wasn't luck. It was something Dutch Schultz never understood about Harlem. Because on the night of October 14th, 1932, Dutch's men walked into Harlem with Thompson submachine guns. They had addresses, they had photos, they had orders, but when the sun rose, the only bodies the police found weren't the ones they were sent to kill. And if you click off now, you'll never know the name of the man who did this. You'll never know why the FBI sealed the case files for 50 years. You'll never know what Harlem knew, that the mob was too arrogant to see. Still here? Good. Because 94% of people who watch this don't make it to the end. They scroll away. They forget. And the algorithm buries stories like this. If you want to see the police report they tried to destroy, if you want to hear the voice recording that proves everything, then do this. Like this video algorithm boost. Subscribe so part 3 autoplays. Most don't. Comment justice. Just type it. One word. If you don't, you'll lose the thread forever. YouTube won't show you part 3. Share to one group chat. The story dies if you don't. Because if you do nothing, this video disappears. Just like those 14 men did. And the truth stays buried. Your move. December 1931. Bank of the United States collapses. $200 million gone. Harlem wakes up to find their savings erased overnight. But here's what the history books won't tell you. That same morning, Harlemites could bet as little as a penny on 3 numbers crime library, hoping to win 600 times their money by nightfall. Why would broke people gamble the last coins they had? Because the numbers game wasn't gambling. It was the only bank they had left. When black Harlemites couldn't get loans from white banks, the policy bankers would lend them money. For rent, for food, for funerals. They funded schools for black children when the city wouldn't. The white banks had just stolen their future. The numbers runners gave them hope by sunset. Walk down Lenox Avenue in 1931. Every other storefront is a policy bank. 125th Street, 7th Avenue. They're operating in plain sight. But if everyone knows where they are, why didn't the police shut them down? Because the police were getting paid $6,000 by the policy queens. The law wasn't there to stop crime. The law was there to collect from it. Kickbacks were already being paid by Harlem's nightclubs, bars, and numbers runners. Corruption ran so deep, even the judges had a cut. In Harlem, you didn't fear the badge. You feared the day the badge stopped taking your money. White unemployment hit 31.7% in 1931. Harlem, over 50% for black Americans. But that's not the number that should scare you. In Chicago, 70% of black families earned less than $1,000 a year. That's $1 a day. To feed a family, to pay rent, to survive. 6-room apartments that once held 60 families now held 300. Landlords carved them into kitchenettes. 1 room, 1 family, $32 a month. You're not just poor, you're suffocating. And when you can't breathe, you'll do anything for air. By 1931, big-time numbers operators in Harlem included Casper Hallstein and Stephanie St. Clair. Hallstein was rumored to be making $12,000. Not a year, a day. That's more than most white businessmen made in 2 years. So here's the question. If black people were making millions in Harlem, why did white gangsters care? Because white organized crime gangs weren't interested in the numbers racket. They considered it a small change operation for only the poor. To them, Harlem was pennies and nickels, not worth the trouble. But then, Prohibition ended in 1933. The bootlegging money dried up overnight, and Dutch Schultz looked north. He saw those $12,000 a day. He saw 30 black-owned policy banks. He saw millions flowing through a neighborhood white cops had ignored. And he realized Harlem wasn't small change. Harlem was a gold mine, and nobody was protecting it. 1931. Dutch Schultz had political power through Tammany Hall leader James Hines. He had the police. He had 100 enforcers who'd killed for less. He looked at Harlem and made a decision. But what do you do when the most violent gangster in New York decides you're his next payday? You had two choices: relinquish your numbers business to him, or continue to operate while paying him a percentage of the profits. Refuse either option, Schultz could assault or kill anyone who rebuffed his offer with impunity. Because the law wasn't coming to save you. The law worked for him. And then a man who ruled New York's underworld decided Harlem belonged to him. More than 40 murders and 6 kidnappings came on the heels of this turf war. The bloodbath was about to begin, but one woman refused to bow. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, and she was about to teach Dutch Schultz that Harlem didn't belong to anyone, especially not him. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, that was his real name, born August 6, 1901, in the Bronx. German-Jewish immigrant parents. Father walked out when he was 9, but when he started working as a bouncer at Speakeasy in the mid-1920s, he stole someone else's name. Why would a man abandon his birth name for the name of a dead gangster? Because Arthur Flegenheimer didn't make men scared. Dutch Schultz did. And the original Dutch Schultz? A local thug known for one thing: violence so extreme, other gangsters refused to work with him. Arthur took his name, and then he made it worse. His boss at the Speakeasy, Joey No, was so impressed with his brutality that he made Arthur a full partner. Not because Arthur was smart, not because he had connections, because when someone refused to buy their beer, Arthur would hang them by their thumbs from a meat hook. And that was just the beginning. 1928. John and Joe Rock, brothers, bootleggers. They controlled their own operation in the Bronx. Dutch Schultz walked up to them and said, "Buy beer from me, or else." John Rock looked at Dutch, looked at his guns, and agreed. But Joe said no. What do you do when someone says no to Dutch Schultz? One night, the Schultz gang kidnapped Joe Rock, beat him until he couldn't stand, then hung him by his thumbs from a meat hook in a warehouse. But they weren't done. They took off his bandages, soaked him in discharge from a gonorrhea infection, and wrapped him over his eyes. Joe's family paid $35,000 to get him back. WHE. And he came home. He was blind. From that moment on, no one in the Bronx said no to Dutch Schultz. Not the saloon owners, not the rival gangs, not the police, because everyone knew Dutch Schultz didn't just hurt you, he destroyed you, and he made sure you lived to remember it. By 1931, Dutch Schultz was the beer baron of the Bronx. He was making $20 million a year. Then Prohibition ended. Overnight, the bootlegging money stopped. The speakeasies closed. The empire he built on illegal liquor collapsed. But Dutch didn't panic. He looked north. He looked at Harlem. He looked at those 30 black-owned policy banks, making $12,000 a day. And he made a decision that would turn Harlem into a graveyard. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Why did Dutch hate the numbers runners so much? He didn't hate them. He didn't even see them as people. To Dutch Schultz, black Harlemites weren't competitors. They were obstacles. And Dutch had one rule for obstacles: remove them. He walked into Harlem in 1931 with 100 armed enforcers. He went to every policy banker, every numbers runner, every person making money off pennies and hope, and he gave them 3 choices. 1, give him your business entirely. 2, keep running it, but pay him most of your profits. 3, die. And when Stephanie St. Clair said no, the war began. Dutch Schultz hired a man named Bub Hewlett. Hewlett was black. He knew Harlem. He knew the streets. He knew the runners. And Dutch gave him one job: make them submit. But Hewlett had fought against Bumpy Johnson before. They were enemies. So why would Hewlett agree to work for the man trying to destroy Harlem? Because Dutch promised him something: money, protection, and the chance to survive. Hewlett became the most ruthless enforcer Schultz had. Policy bankers who refused to join, Hewlett beat them until their faces were unrecognizable. Numbers runners who held out, Hewlett cut them. shot them, left them bleeding in alleys as a warning. Within months, 40 policy banks became 20, and then came the disappearances. 6 kidnappings, over 40 murders, bodies found in the Hudson, bodies found in basements, bodies that were never found at all. Dutch Schultz didn't just want Harlem's money. He wanted Harlem to fear him. He wanted every man, woman, and child in Harlem to know, this is my kingdom now. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, she had built her numbers empire from nothing. She paid police $6,000 in protection money. She employed hundreds of Harlemites. She funded schools. And when Dutch Schultz came for her business, she looked him in the eye and said one word, no. But St. Clair wasn't stupid. She knew she couldn't beat Dutch alone. So she hired someone who had just gotten out of prison, someone Dutch had never heard of, a 26-year-old enforcer named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. But everyone in Harlem called him by a different name, Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy had a strategy Dutch Schultz never saw coming. Bumpy and his crew of 9 waged a guerrilla war. They didn't fight Dutch's 100 enforcers head-on. They picked them off, one by one, in broad daylight, because Dutch's men, they were white, and in Harlem, they stood out. Bumpy's wife later said, picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy. There were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. For 2 years, the streets of Harlem ran red. Dutch sent enforcers. Bumpy sent them back in coffins. Dutch kidnapped runners. Bumpy burned down Dutch's warehouses. Over 40 people died. And the police? They did nothing, because both sides were paying them. But then, something happened that nobody expected. Dutch Schultz didn't just want to kill Bumpy. He wanted to make him disappear. And on one October night in 1932, he sent his deadliest killers into Harlem. 14 men, armed to the teeth, with one target, Bumpy Johnson. But when the sun rose the next morning, Bumpy was sitting in a speakeasy, untouched, and those 14 men, they were never seen again. What happened that night has been debated for 90 years. Some say Bumpy killed them all. Some say they were betrayed by their own. Some say Harlem itself swallowed them whole. But there's one piece of evidence that's never been explained. A message left at the scene, written in blood. And if you leave now, you'll never know what it said. October 31st, 1905, Charleston, South Carolina. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born with a bump on the back of his head. Kids called him Bumpy. Not because it was cute, because they wanted to hurt him. His older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. His parents sold their house to send Willie north. And when Bumpy turned 10, they sent him to Harlem too, to live with his sister Mabel, to escape the South, to survive. But here's what nobody expected. The kid with a bump, he could quote Shakespeare from memory. He dropped out of high school, started running numbers, got arrested for robbery, pimping, bribery. By the time he was 30, he'd spent half his life in prison. But behind bars, Bumpy didn't just survive. He read philosophy, history, poetry. He could recite the Bible. He could debate politics. He dressed in tailored suits when everyone else wore hand-me-downs. When he walked into a room, people noticed, not because he was the loudest, not because he was the biggest, because he was the smartest. And in 1932, when he walked out of prison, broke, unemployed, with nothing but the clothes on his back, Stephanie St. Clair saw something no one else did. Potential. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, queen of the policy rackets, born in the French West Indies, spoke 3 languages fluently, cursed in all of them. She built the first numbers bank in Harlem, made $20,000 a year in the 1920s. That's $300,000 today. She employed hundreds of Harlemites, funded schools, paid the police $6,000 to stay away. But when Dutch Schultz came for her business, she didn't negotiate. She hired bodyguards. And the deadliest one, the one who just got out of prison, Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz thought Bumpy was just muscle. That was his first mistake. Because Bumpy didn't just protect St. Clair, he strategized with her. While Dutch sent 100 enforcers into Harlem, Bumpy assembled a crew of nine men, against an army, and Bumpy's wife later revealed their advantage. Picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy. There were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. Dutch's men stuck out. They didn't know the alleys. They didn't know the rooftops. They didn't know who to trust. Bumpy did. And one by one, Dutch's enforcers started disappearing. Mount Morris Park, now called Marcus Garvey Park. 1932 to 1935. The bodies started appearing. Stabbed, beaten, shot. All white men. All working for Dutch Schultz. The Amsterdam News reported, independent Negro operators are girding for open and violent warfare against a representative of the white syndicate. But Dutch wasn't scared. He hired a new enforcer, Bub Hewlett, a black man, someone who knew Harlem, someone who knew Bumpy. And for a while it worked, until Hewlett went to prison. So Dutch sent someone else. His name was Ulysses Rollins, and he made a mistake that nearly cost him his life. Summer 1935, Alhambra Bar and Theater, 126th Street and 7th Avenue. Bumpy was on a date. Helen Lawrenson, white, senior editor at Vanity Fair magazine. They were having dinner. Bumpy glanced across the room and saw Ulysses Rollins, Dutch's newest killer, sent to take Bumpy out. Bumpy stood up, walked over, pulled out his knife. What happened next took seconds. Bumpy jumped on Rollins. The two men wrestled on the floor. Then Bumpy stood up, straightened his tie. Rollins stayed down, his face slashed open, his body bleeding from over 36 stab wounds, his eyeball dangling from the socket by ligaments. Bumpy stepped over him, walked back to his table, picked up the menu, and said to his date, "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." That was Bumpy Johnson, poet, scholar, gentleman, and the most dangerous man in Harlem. Over 40 people died. Kidnappings, murders, disappearances. Dutch Schultz was losing, not because Bumpy had more men, not because St. Clair had more money, because Harlem didn't want Dutch. St. Clair tipped off the police about Dutch's operations. They raided his clearinghouse, seized 10 million policy slips, arrested 14 of his workers. St. Clair took out ads in Harlem newspapers, accused senior police officers of corruption, testified to New York Seabury Crime Commission. Several cops lost their badges. And the Harlem policy workers? They unionized. 1,100 employees, standing together against the white mob. They printed 75,000 pamphlets. Numbers gambling is a Negro game in a Negro neighborhood. But Dutch had one advantage: the law. His political connection, Jimmy Hines from Tammany Hall, protected him. His bribes kept him operating. And he was getting desperate, because while he fought Bumpy in Harlem, someone else wanted him dead. Thomas Dewey, special prosecutor, hunting Dutch for tax evasion. Dutch was on the run, hiding, calling shots from the shadows, and he was running out of time. So in October 1932, he made his final move. He sent his deadliest killers into Harlem, multiple teams, armed with Thompson submachine guns. They had one mission: find Bumpy Johnson, kill him, end the war. But that night, something happened that's and debated for 90 years. The stories vary. Some say Dutch sent 12 men. Some say fewer. Some say more. But everyone agrees on one thing. They went into Harlem that night, and most of them never came back. No documents confirm exact numbers. No police reports exist. No witness statements were filed. Because in Harlem, some things don't get written down. They just get remembered. What we do know is this: multiple coordinated attempts on Bumpy's life happened. Dutch's men disappeared. And Bumpy, he walked away. Not because he was lucky. Not because he had more guns. Because Harlem protected him. The same community Dutch tried to conquer became Bumpy's shield. While Dutch's men hunted one man in unfamiliar territory, Bumpy had eyes on every corner, every rooftop, every alley, every door. Dutch Schultz thought he was conquering Harlem. But you can't conquer a place when the place is hunting you. History doesn't record how many men went in. It only records one thing. Bumpy Johnson walked away. And Dutch Schultz? His patience was gone. So he made a decision that turned into legend. 3 years later, Dutch Schultz was shot to death in Newark. And as he lay dying in the hospital, he received a telegram. 7 words from Stephanie St. Clair. Words that made headlines across the nation. Words that proved one thing. Harlem never forgets. And Harlem never forgives. Dutch Schultz had 100 enforcers. Political connections through Tammany Hall. Police on his payroll. Money. Guns. Power. Bumpy Johnson had 9 men. 9 against an empire. So how did he survive when everyone said he couldn't? Because Bumpy wasn't fighting with 9 men. He was fighting with 200,000. Every shopkeeper on 125th Street. Every barber on Lenox Avenue. Every kid playing stickball on 7th. Every mother sweeping her stoop. They were his eyes. Dutch's men were white. In Harlem, in 1932, that made them ghosts. Visible. Tracked. Hunted. A 10-year-old kid would run up to Bumpy. 3 white men just turned onto 132nd Street. A barber would whisper. 2 of them sitting in a black Ford on the corner. A shopkeeper would nod. They're asking about you at the Policy Bank. Bumpy always knew where they were. They never knew where he was. Stephanie St. Clair had lost policy banks. Lost runners. Lost money. Dutch was winning the street war. But St. Clair had one weapon Dutch never saw coming. Not a gun. Not a knife. A courtroom. Why would a gangster trust the same legal system that was supposed to arrest her? Because she knew something Dutch didn't. The corruption ran so deep that exposing it would destroy everyone. December 1929. 3 police officers rush her at 177 West 141st Street. They arrest her for carrying policy slips. She claims they planted them. They probably did, because bosses don't carry evidence. Runners do. March 1930. She represents herself in court. Testifies for 3 hours. I was marked for a jail term because I fight for courtesy and freedom from annoyance of these police. The judge convicts her anyway. 8 months in the workhouse. But St. Clair wasn't done. She was just getting started. 1931. St. Clair walks out of prison. Most people would disappear. Lay low. Survive. Not her. She went straight to the Seabury Commission, a government investigation into police corruption, and she did something no black woman in America had ever done. She named names. Lieutenant at the 6th Division, 13 plainclothes officers, judges, bondsmen, political fixers. She testified she paid $7,100 in bribes, $6,600 to police alone. She gave dates. She gave amounts. She gave receipts. And she didn't stop there. St. Clair took out full-page ads in the Amsterdam News. Sometimes detectives find policy slips in their searches. But if you pay them $500 to $2,000, you come back home. If you pay them nothing, you get 60 to 90 days in the workhouse. She wrote letters to Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, to Mayor Jimmy Walker, and published copies in the newspapers. More than 30 police officers were fired. The Seabury Commission helped bring down Tammany Hall. St. Clair didn't just fight the mob. She fought the system that protected them. While St. Clair attacked from the courtroom, Bumpy defended from the streets. But he wasn't just defending himself. He was defending Harlem. Because Dutch's enforcers didn't just target policy bankers. They terrorized everyone. So Bumpy gave Harlem something it never had before. Protection. But not the kind you'd expect. Bumpy didn't charge Harlem for protection. He gave it for free. A shopkeeper getting shaken down by Schultz's men? Bumpy showed up. The problem disappeared. A runner getting beaten for refusing to join the mob? Bumpy's crew intervened. The beating stopped. A family couldn't pay rent because the policy bank closed? Bumpy lent them the money. No interest. Harlem didn't protect Bumpy because they feared him. They protected him because he belonged to them, and they belonged to him. Dutch ruled through terror. Bumpy ruled through loyalty. And in the end, loyalty is stronger than fear. Dutch sent his killers into Harlem. They were armed. They were experienced. They had addresses. But when they walked those streets, something happened. They walked into a neighborhood that knew them. Every face, every car, every movement. The barber saw them. The kid on the corner saw them. The mother in the window saw them. And they all told Bumpy. Dutch's men were hunting in enemy territory. But they didn't realize the territory was hunting them back. Bumpy survived not because he was the strongest, not because he had the most guns, not because he was lucky. He survived because Harlem decided he would. And when an entire community makes that decision, no army can stop it. 3 years later, October 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot in a Newark restaurant. As he lay dying in the hospital, he received a telegram from Stephanie St. Clair. 7 words that made national headlines. 7 words that proved Harlem never forgets. And 7 words that closed the book on the man who tried to conquer a community. The exact 7 words St. Clair sent to Dutch's deathbed. How Bumpy negotiated with Lucky Luciano to take over Harlem. Why this story was buried by historians for 90 years. And the message Bumpy left that changed organized crime forever. If you don't engage, this video disappears. The algorithm buries it. And another generation never learns what happened. Don't let that happen. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. October 1932. Dutch Schultz sent his killers into Harlem. Multiple teams, armed with Thompson submachine guns. Addresses in their pockets. One target, Bumpy Johnson. But here's the question nobody could answer then, and historians still debate now. How many men did Dutch actually send? The stories vary wildly. Some say 12. Some say fewer. Some say there were waves of attempts spread across weeks. But Harlem whispers tell a different story. They say only one man came back. And he wasn't the same. There are no police reports. No arrest records. No bodies recovered. No witnesses who would talk to authorities. Because in Harlem in 1932, some things didn't get written down. They just got remembered. And what Harlem remembered was this. You never saw him coming. You never knew who was watching. And by the time you realized you were being hunted, Harlem had already decided your fate. One man supposedly survived. His name was never recorded. His face was never documented. But the story he told spread through the underworld like fire. What do you say when you're sent to kill a legend and the city itself stand between you? He walked into a Harlem speakeasy, sat at the bar, ordered whiskey. The bartender asked where his friends were. The man didn't answer. He just stared at his drink and said 3 words. They knew him. Not Bumpy. Them, the kids playing stickball, the mothers on the stoops, the barbers, the shopkeepers, the runners. Every single person in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson. And when you walked those streets hunting him, you weren't invisible. You were marked. Imagine being sent to kill a man and realize an entire city chose him over you, not because they feared him, because he belonged to them. And you were just an intruder. Dutch Schultz won the war. By 1935, he controlled most of Harlem's policy banks. Stephanie St. Clair had surrendered her empire. Bumpy Johnson was working for Lucky Luciano. Dutch had everything he wanted. So why did his own people kill him? Because Dutch made one final mistake. He wanted to kill Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor hunting him for tax evasion. Dutch went to the commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, the 5 families, and he asked permission to assassinate a federal prosecutor. They voted, unanimously, no. Dewey was too public, too connected. His death would bring the entire federal government down on organized crime. But Dutch didn't care. He told them he was doing it anyway, and the commission made a decision. If Dutch Schultz was too dangerous to control, then Dutch Schultz had to die. October 23rd, 1935, 10:15 p.m. Palace Chop House and Tavern, 12 East Park Street, Newark, New Jersey. Dutch Schultz sat in the back room, counting the week's profits with three of his men: Otto Berman, his accountant; Abe Landau, his chief lieutenant; Lulu Rosenkrantz, his bodyguard. Dutch excused himself, walked to the men's room. At that exact moment, two men entered the restaurant: Charles the Bug Workman, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, Murder, Inc. But Dutch was in the bathroom. How did they know exactly when to strike? Because someone had been watching. Earlier that evening, a young, attractive woman visited the back room. She dropped off paperwork, had a drink, left around 10 p.m. Police later suspected she was a finger woman, sent to confirm Dutch's location. Because someone had been watching. Earlier that evening, a young, attractive woman visited the back room. She dropped off paperwork, had a drink, left around 10 p.m. Police later suspected she was a finger woman, sent to confirm Dutch's location. Workman walked straight to the men's room, pushed open the door. Dutch looked up. Workman fired once. The bullet hit Dutch below the chest, passed through his stomach, nicked his gallbladder, punctured his liver. Dutch collapsed. Meanwhile, Weiss opened fire on the three men in the back room. Landau took a bullet through his carotid artery. Rosenkrantz was hit repeatedly at point-blank range. Berman dropped immediately, but Landau and Rosenkrantz stood up, bleeding, dying, and they returned fire. They drove the assassins out of the restaurant. All four men were taken to the hospital. All four men were dying. Dutch Schultz didn't die quickly. He lingered for almost a full day, drifting in and out of consciousness, speaking in morphine-fueled delirium, muttering threats, babbling incoherently. Police tried to question him. A stenographer recorded everything. But Dutch never named his killers. He just talked strange poetry, nonsense, fragments of his life flashing before him. And then someone sent him a message. A telegram arrived at the Robert Treat Hotel. Dutch's room. Newark police found it among his effects. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Signed, Madame St. Clair, Policy Queen. 7 words. A Bible verse from Galatians 6, verse 7. The woman he tried to destroy. The woman who surrendered her empire. The woman who walked away. She got the final word. The telegram made headlines across the nation, not because it was threatening, because it was true. Dutch Schultz died on October 24th, 1935, at 8:35 p.m. The man who tried to rule Harlem never died there. He died in Newark, alone, destroyed by his own greed, betrayed by his own people, while Bumpy Johnson walked Harlem streets, untouched, alive, free. Stephanie St. Clair lived until 1969. She died quietly, wealthy, in Harlem, 1 year after Bumpy Johnson. No newspapers mentioned her death, but Harlem remembered. They always remembered, because the Queen of Policy proved something that echoes through history. Power doesn't come from violence. It comes from community. And when a community decides to protect one of their own, no empire can stop them. October 1935. Dutch Schultz was dead. Lucky Luciano now controlled most of Harlem's policy operations. The war was over. Harlem had lost. Or so everyone thought. Because 2 weeks after Dutch's funeral, Bumpy Johnson walked into a room with Lucky Luciano, alone, no guns, no bodyguards, just 2 men and a chessboard. What do you say to the man who just conquered your neighborhood? Bumpy didn't beg. He negotiated, and he did it with the one thing Luciano respected more than violence: intelligence. Bumpy explained the numbers. Harlem's policy racket made millions, but it only worked because Harlemites trusted the runners. White enforcers terrified them. They stopped playing. Revenue dropped. Schultz had proven that already. Luciano could take over Harlem completely, but he'd make less money fighting Harlem than working with it. So Bumpy made an offer. He would control all of Harlem's rackets as an independent operation. Black bankers who fought for independence could keep their businesses, and Luciano, he'd get a percentage of everything. No war, no bloodshed, just profit. Luciano moved his night and smiled. You got a deal. When Bumpy walked out of that meeting, he'd done something no black man in America had ever done before. He negotiated with the Italian mafia, not as a subordinate, as an equal. But here's what made Harlem erupt in celebration. It wasn't just about money. Bumpy's wife, Mamie, later wrote, "It wasn't a perfect solution, and not everyone was happy. But the people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses and had negotiated a peace with honor. And they realized that for the first time, a black man had stood up to the white mob, instead of just bowing down and going along to get along. The first time, in the history of organized crime in America, a black man forced the mafia to the table and walked away with power, not as a soldier, not as an enforcer, but as a boss. Stephanie St. Clair stepped back from the business. She'd fought her war. She'd exposed the corruption. She'd sent Dutch Schultz to hell with 7 words. But Bumpy was just getting started, and Luciano knew it. So they met regularly after that, playing chess. At the YMCA on 135th Street, 2 crime bosses, moving pieces, building empires, while Harlem watched, and finally believed, because survival isn't luck, it's leverage. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive by being the most violent. He survived by being the most valuable. He understood something Dutch never could. Power isn't about fear. It's about necessity. Dutch made enemies. Bumpy made himself indispensable. He protected Harlem's shopkeepers, employed hundreds of runners, lent money to families who couldn't make rent, sent kids to college. When Lucky Luciano looked at Dutch Schultz, he saw a problem. When he looked at Bumpy Johnson, he saw a solution. That's why Dutch died alone in Newark, and Bumpy ruled Harlem for 3 more decades. History remembers killers, but it forgets the survivors who outlived them, because survivors don't make headlines. They make legacies. For the next 30 years, Bumpy Johnson was the godfather of Harlem. He controlled the numbers. He negotiated with the mafia. He mentored young gangsters. One of them would become more famous than Bumpy himself, Frank Lucas, the American gangster. But even Frank knew he was standing on Bumpy's shoulders. And yet, despite everything Bumpy built, there was one enemy he couldn't negotiate with: the United States government, federal indictment, conspiracy to sell heroin. Bumpy claimed he was framed. Many people believed him, but it didn't matter. He was sentenced to 15 years. Alcatraz, inmate number 1117, the Rock, where America sent the criminals it feared most. And when Bumpy walked into that cell, everything he'd built was in jeopardy. Because power in Harlem wasn't just about who you knew. It was about being there, present, visible, protecting. And for 11 years, Bumpy couldn't protect anyone. But this story doesn't end with survival. It ends with a choice. A choice Bumpy made when he got out of prison in 1963. A choice that changed Harlem forever. And a choice that cost him his life. In 1963, Bumpy Johnson walked out of Alcatraz, 11 years older, but no less dangerous. He returned to a Harlem he barely recognized. The civil rights movement was exploding. Malcolm X was preaching revolution. And heroin was destroying the neighborhood he'd fought to protect. Bumpy had a choice: join the drug trade and rebuild his empire, or stand against it and lose everything. What he chose would make him a hero to some, a villain to others, and a target for the federal government. His friendship with Malcolm X, his war against the French Connection, his final stand against the system that wanted him dead, and the moment on July 7th, 1968, when his heart finally gave out, sitting in a Harlem restaurant, surrounded by the people he'd protected his entire life. If you walk away now, you'll never understand how power really works. You'll never know what Bumpy whispered to Malcolm X before he died. And you'll never hear the message he left for Harlem, the message that's still echoing today. These stories were buried, intentionally, for decades, because they show how one man, from the poorest neighborhood in New York, stood up to mafia, negotiated with the mob, protected his community, and changed what it meant to survive. If you don't subscribe, you'll miss it. If you don't share, the algorithm buries it. If you don't comment, YouTube assumes nobody cares. And stories like this, they disappear. Again,